Hello and welcome. My name is Sarah Herzog, and this is the third part in a 5-part tutorial showing how to create a simple health system in Unity. So this section will cover how to actually display the health using a text object in the Unity UI. So in order for you to actually start this section, you need to have completed part 2. So if you have not yet done that, go ahead and go back and do both part 1 and part 2. And you will also need at this point to have a user interface created. If you don't already have one, it's very easy to create one. You can do that by going up in Unity to your component window and adding a UI and adding any of the UI objects that will automatically create a user interface for you. So it's not too complex, but we won't be covering the basics of user interfaces in this tutorial. We're going to assume that you have one already created. Okay, so in our last tutorial, we covered setting up a numerical value for your player's health. So instead of just having them being killed instantly by the hazard, we now have a numerical value, but that value is hidden by default. It's not visible. So we are going to, in this tutorial, show you how to make that value visible to your players using a UI text object. Okay, and we'll make a new script for how to do that as well. So let's, the main thing to think about again, when we think about how we're going to implement things in coding, I like to think of conditions and actions. So our action here is clearly to show something on the screen, right? It's going to show a number on the screen. And what's our condition? Well, our condition could be every time that number changes, we could change what's on the screen, and that would work. But in this example, we're going to make it just every frame, every single frame, we will update the number that is on the screen to match whatever the player's current health is. It's a little bit of overkill, but for a beginner level, it's absolutely fine. And as long as you don't have a lot of these going on in your scene at the same time, it's not going to cause a huge amount of problems for your game in terms of, processing power. Okay? So our plan is condition, every frame, action, update your UI text to match the player's current health. So how do we do that? Well, first of all, we need to have a UI in the scene. So if you don't already have one, you need to add one. And you can do that if we're going to add a text object. So you can do that by simply going up to your component menu up here, going to UI, and we're going to be adding a text object. You go to game object here, going to UI and adding a text object. Okay, so I've done that, and because I already have a canvas, it's put my text object inside the existing canvas. If you didn't already have a canvas, it should have created a UI canvas for you. Okay, now I have a text object here, and if I double click on that text object in the hierarchy, it will go to it in my scene view, and that helps a lot because remember, at least by default in the way that the Unity UI is set up, your UI is on a really different scale than your game world. So my player is somewhere very, very small down this lower hand corner here that you can't actually see. My UI is really big. Okay, so that can be a bit confusing, but just think of it as the UI is in a different dimension, a different world than your game itself, your game world. Okay, so if you just double click on them, it's an easy way to get back and forth between them. So you can double click on the player to go back to where the player is in your scene, and double click on your text or your UI to go to where it is. So my text has been added, but it's added in this lower left-hand corner. It's really hard to see. It's a horrible color. You can't see it either in the scene view or in the game view. So I'm going to go ahead and move it. First of all, I want it to be in the top left instead, and I don't want it to be black. It's so hard to see. So with the text selected, I'm going to go down and change the text color by clicking on the color bar down there, and I'm going to just change it to white so it's a lot easier to see. And I'm going to make it bigger because right now it's very, very small. Now my inspector is a little bit weirdly set up at the moment because I had it set to debug mode. I'm changing it back to normal mode now so that it's easier to see. So I have that set up from a previous tutorial. So in normal mode, you can then see what the text value is for this text, and we're going to change it to say health : and this is going to be a label for our health. So this actually isn't going to be changing this text object. We're going to make a separate text object that will be changing every frame. Let's go ahead and change the font size to something a bit beefier. I'm going to try size 30, And when I've done that, my text disappeared, and that's because the box for that text isn't big enough anymore. So if I make it bigger again, then we can see the health again. I think that's a lot better size, so I'm going to leave it at that size. I am going to change the name of this game object though, because right now it's just called text and that's not very clear. You should always make sure your game objects are named very clearly. Never just leave them as something default. You want to make sure they're named very clearly so that you can actually see what's going on in your hierarchy. Your hierarchy is often much more useful to find objects than your main scene, especially when you get an awful lot of objects. You're going to need to be able to use your hierarchy. And in order to use it, you must use good names for your game objects. So let's call this one health label. Now, game object names can have spaces. That's one of the few exceptions to the rule of no spaces. So you can add a space in there if you like. You can call it whatever you want, as long as it is descriptive and clear. Okay, let's duplicate health label in order to make our actual health value. And I'm going to do that by selecting health label and typing in Control D, but you can do it by copy pasting or any right clicking and choosing duplicate, whatever you like. I personally like to use Control D because it's nice and quick, and I use duplication a lot. Okay, so that's made a copy right on top of my other one. So I'm just going to move it over to the side there using the move tool. And I'm going to change the text inside it to just the number 0. Assuming you start, by default, you don't have any health. And then I'm going to change the name of this object from being health label 1 to health value display. How about that? Health value display. So that's nice and specific, explaining what that is. So that is the object that's actually going to be changing. Okay? All right. So now we need a script because this isn't going to change automatically. We have to write a script to do that. So let's go down to our project folder, into the scripts folder. I'm going to right click it and create a C# script. And remember, before you do it, click away or anything, you need to rename it. So let's rename it to be, let's call it health display. Health display. Okay. So I have a new script called health display. I'm going to double click that to open it in Visual Studio. And I'm going to go ahead and reload my solution. It's asking if I want to do that. Okay, so here's my health display. So we are going to keep the start and update functions this time because we're actually going to use them. So you don't have to delete those. But we are going to need some variables at the top here. So let's go ahead and add some spaces here. And we're going to have a variable called text. And it's going to be a health. Let's call it, now I see here, when I typed in text and then tried to press a space, it's showing that text isn't a recognized variable type. Well, why is that? That's because text is part of Unity's UI system. And when you're writing a script, by default, you don't have access to the UI system, right? It's a special part of Unity. So that's easy. We can still get access to it, but we have to specifically tell Unity that we want access to the UI system in our script. We do that by going up to the top here, and where it says all these using statements, we're going to add a new one, because using statements are basically saying we plan to use this portion of the code. Okay, so we plan to now use the UI portion of the code. So we're going to type in using Unity Engine .ui. And that will allow us to use that portion of Unity's code. So now, if we go back down to our health display and we go to where we were writing our variable, you notice that text has now changed to be a nice aqua color to indicate that it is recognized as a type of variable. It is allowed now. Okay, so we're going to have a variable called text. And we're going to have a name for this variable. Let's call it health value. Okay, so health value text. What does that mean? It means we're going to have a variable that contains a text component. So in Unity, I'm going to go back to Unity now, our health label and health value display both have text components on them. So this is saying we're going to have a variable that is going to allow us to edit and change a text component. So it's going to reference a text component in the scene, and it will allow us to edit and change that text component. Okay, it's kind of like having someone's address, being able to go to their house and move their furniture around. That's essentially what we're doing. Our text component, we have an address to it. We can go over to its house and change the letters in the text box. Okay, that's what we're doing. So we're going to have that there. We will also need a access to the player, right? Because we want to be able to find out from the player what their health is. So we need a variable for that as well. And just like the text component, this is like an address to the player where we can go call them up. Hey, player, what's your health right now? And then we can go in and change that in our text display. So let's go ahead and say player health. And we're going to call this just player, make it nice and simple. So player health, player. These are two variables, okay? And let's put a note here, variables that are references to objects in our scene and to the specific components on those objects. So yes, player health is a script that we wrote, but it's still a component in Unity. Okay. Right, good. So far, so good. So let's go ahead and in the start function, we're going to initialize these two values. We do not need to make these visible in the Unity editor. We're going to initialize them with code. So in the start function, let's go ahead and start with the health value. So we're going to attach this script, our health display script, to the bit of the game object that actually has the health value on it. So it's quite easy to get a component that is attached to the same game object that your script is attached to. So our script is already attached to this component. We can simply use the getComponent function to find out any other scripts that are attached to this object. Okay, so let's do that. So we are going to say health value equals getComponent. And then we use these angle brackets. We did this in a previous tutorial. We use these angle brackets, and inside there we say the type of component we want to get. In this case, a text component, because remember, health value is a text variable. So the text component is what we want. Then we just use the open close parentheses to indicate that it's a function and a semicolon to end the line of code. So this will go to our current game object, the same one that the health display script is attached to, and it will find the text object and store it in that health value variable. Okay, so let's just note that. Get the text component attached to this object and store it in the variable. That's what we're doing there. Okay. Now, what about the player? Well, the player is not going to be on the same object, so it's not quite as easy. But thankfully, we have another function that will let us do this. It is a function called findObjectOfType. Now, this is not a quick function because it will search your entire scene and check for all of the objects and check for all of the components and find one that matches the type you've given it. However, it is okay to do that as long as it doesn't happen every frame. So we are only doing that at the very beginning of the game, and that's okay. It's not going to cause a problem with performance. Okay, so let's go ahead and create a new line of code here. We're going to say player equals, so player is our variable that's going to contain our player health. And we're going to use the function findObjectOfType, and we're going to use our our angle brackets, just like we did for components. When we're using types, we usually use angle brackets. Okay, findObjectOfType, and then we're going to put in player health. Okay, parentheses and semicolon. So this will allow us to look for all the objects in the game and find the one that has player health and put it into that slot. This is fine because there's only going to be one player in our game, so it's quite easy to find the player health and put it into our player variable. Let's put a note here. Search the entire scene for the player health component and store it in the variable. Assuming we find it. We're going to assume that we do. Same for this one. We're assuming that we found our text component. Okay. That's everything we need to do to initialize our script. So our script is now ready to go. We've got our health value and our player. So now we just need to actually do our action, our condition and action. So the condition in this case is the update function. We want to, every frame, update our text to match the player's health. So that's fairly easy to do. So the thing we were going to want to do there is add a new couple lines. And all we have to do is set our health value dot text. So the text component with a lowercase t, notice, is part of the text with an uppercase T component. So lowercase t is a variable inside uppercase T component. It's a bit confusing, okay? So we're going to go to our health value and then go dot and say lowercase t. And this is the text that is actually going to be displayed on screen. It's going to be just some letters, right? These letters will be displayed on screen. So we're going to change that to match the player's current health. So we just say equals, because it's a variable, we're storing something into it. So the health value dot text equals, and then we're going to say player, and we're going to go to the player, and we want to get the player's health. So we would do get health. Now what we haven't done is we don't have a way to get health yet. We need to add this function to our player. Okay, so let's go ahead and go to our player health, and we're going to add a function in player health. If you don't already have player health open, go back to Unity and double click your player health script. We're going to add a get health function in here. This is a type of function called a getter. And these are very, very common in programming, and they simply allow us to get a number and return it back to the calling code. Okay, so we need to add some new lines at the bottom of our player health script. Make sure that you keep those inside the outer parentheses. And we're going to add a public function because it needs to be accessible from a different script because we're trying to get it from health display. So we need it to be public so that health display can actually access it. And instead of void, here's where we're not using void in this case. We're going to use int because we're going to return an integer value. We're going to give back some information from player health into health display. And in order for that to work, we need to return an integer value. Okay? And then we're going to set the name of the function as get health. And all this function is going to do is going to have a single line of code, and that line is return space current health semicolon. So this return means this is the bit we're going to give back to the code that's asking for this information. Okay, so return means give that information, and the information is going to be the current health. So this integer means there will be information given back. This return is where you actually give the information back. So let's put some notes here. Getter function to give information to the calling code. The int means that an integer whole number will be given back. The return is what will be given back. So we are saying an integer is the type that will be given back, and this return line is actually what value is being given to the code that's running this function. So back in health display, we are using get health and a semicolon at the end. And this is still not going to work quite correctly, because what this is going to give us, if you mouse over it, Visual Studio will give you an error message, and it will tell you, cannot implicitly convert type int to string. What does that mean? Cannot implicitly convert, as it's very complicated sounding. But all it's saying is that this value is a number, an integer, and it needs text. And it's not smart enough to automatically change text into, number into text. So in order to do that yourself, all you have to do is before the semicolon, but after that parenthesis, we're going to do another dot, and we're going to do toString, and that is a function. So we need an open and close parenthesis. So overall, what this is saying is go to the player. We got our player, go to it. That's what the dot means. Get the health value, and that will go into player health and return that information to us. Go to the health value and change it into text. And then store that text in our health value text display. Okay, so let's go ahead and save that. Let's go ahead and also add some notes here. So we're saying get the current health value from the player using the get health function. Change that number to text using toString. And on the health value text component, set the text to be the number we just got. Okay, that's what this is doing. So I'm going to save that. Make sure you've also saved your changes to your player health, right? If it's not saved, it won't work in Unity, so it's very important to do that. Okay? And then go back to Unity and let's see what actually happens here. So first of all, we need to actually put this script onto our health value display. If you haven't done that, you need to do that. So if a script isn't attached to something, it won't do anything. So we need the script to be attached. And remember that when we wrote the script, we said get component text. That means we're assuming that this health display script that we've written will be on the same game object as the text. Okay, so that means we need to put it on the same game object that the text is that we're going to change. All right, so we're not going to put it on health label. We're not going to put it some other random place. We have to put it on health value display. That's where it goes. So let's drag our health display onto the health value display object. And it's attached now. And if I press play, we should see that 0 change into a 5 because my player has 5 health. And if I then run into this saw, it goes down to 3. If I run into it again, it goes to 1. And finally, it goes to 0 and our player is destroyed. So hopefully that worked for you. Now, I know there were some slightly more advanced concepts in this tutorial. So if you got confused, please go back through, listen to it again, see if you can figure out what went on. If you have errors, make sure to check and read them carefully, and that may help you to solve them. And double check your spelling. That's the most often, for beginners, the most common mistake is not being very, very careful with your spelling. Also make sure you have semicolons and your curly brackets are in the right place and all of those things. Very easy to get confused at the beginning as to how those work. So double check all of those things. The other thing that you may wish to check is using the debug functionality that I showed you in the last tutorial to check if your player's actual health on the player matches what is displayed in the text or in the Unity window if you're having issues. If it's working properly, you don't need to check that. All right, our next tutorial will explain how to use icons instead of a health value. So that's where you should go next. And after that, I'll show you how to use bars instead of a health text value. So that is where you should go next after that, if that's what you're interested in doing. In the future, we will have some tutorials that will show you how to make enemies move around, make them attack, make your player attack. But for now, we're focusing on the health value display. So thank you for watching. If this was useful to you, please consider giving the video a like or following our channel. If you have a question about anything in this video, please feel free to comment in the comments below. And I hope you have a good rest of your day and enjoy your coding.